Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing simchat le'olam, kol ha'yeladim now. Simcha to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simcha to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftorah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah.
What happened to our good friend Zeke?
Rick, we leave our good friend Zeke for the next 6 weeks, at least or so, and return this week to the prophet whose text we most read for the Haftorot, our good friend Isaiah.
Want to call him Izzy?
Well, you can call him Izzy, but Isaiah always struck me as kind of a stuffed shirt. So I'll just stick with Isaiah. In any case, this week, we're back to reading the regularly scheduled Haftarah for the Parshat. Although that won't last for long, as next week, we're back to a special Haftarah, another Haftarah for Shabbat HaGadol. And then the following week, we have yet another Haftarah for the 7th day of Pesach. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine wine and talking Haftarah with my good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How you doing, Rick?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm a little subdued today.
Rick, you're the most optimistic and cheerful fellow I know. What's got you down?
Didn't say I was down, just subdued. The Haftorah here just doesn't have a lot of special trope. There's just not a whole lot to get excited about.
Well, I must admit that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're starting to read the book of Vayikra, or Leviticus, and not too many people find much to get excited about in the Torah reading either. But to tell you the truth, there's some very interesting stuff in the Haftarah. So if you'll permit me, allow me to dive into the text.
Dive right ahead.
This week's Haftarah is 31 verses spanning parts of two chapters of Isaiah, chapter 43 and 44. The connection to the Parsha is clear. In Vayikra, we learn in great detail about the sacrifices that the people are to offer in service to God. Starting in verse 23 of chapter 43, Isaiah, speaking on behalf of God, accuses the people of not bringing the appropriate sacrifices as instructed, not the burnt offerings, nor the grain offerings, nor the incense as required. Instead, the people burden God with their offenses and crimes.
So Isaiah is chastising the people for not carrying out the rituals as described in the Parsha.
Perhaps, or perhaps it's all a metaphor for the people's disloyalty in the past as well as in the present. But in the future, verse 25 seems to suggest that God will forgive, or at least forget the transgressions. And the opening verses of chapter 44 seem to indicate a rather hopeful vision of a divine creator who has chosen Jacob, meaning the people, who waters a thirsty land and blesses their offspring with prosperity, and only requires that they pledge, the people pledge, their loyalty to God by saying that they are for the Lord. It's almost like a restatement of the covenant or brit between God and the people.
So all will be forgiven, just like that.
Well, Billy agrees, but there is a catch. Verses 9 through 20 present an implicit warning. Alter calls these verses a lengthy polemic against idolatry, which is one of the sins that the people committed prior to their exile, specifically against the fabricators of idols. These verses are wonderfully descriptive and I think even humorous. My favorite part is the description in verses 14 through 16, where the same wood that is used to construct the idol is also used by the craftsman as fuel for baking bread and a warming fire. And after making this false god with the rest of the wood, he bows to it and says, "Save me, for you are my God."
Yeah, just like in Kitisa a couple of weeks ago with the golden calf, where Aaron makes the calf out of all the jewelry, and he says, "Ela Elohecha Yisrael," this is your God, O Israel.
Exactly. That's the sin. Clearly, this is in juxtaposition to the service that the one true God expects of us. As we are reminded in verse 21, God created man, not the other way around. We conclude the Haftarah with a wonderfully positive vision, a cosmic celebration of God's power and deeds that reads like a psalm. Sing gladly, O heavens, for the Lord has done it. Shout out, you depths of the earth. Burst forth in glad song, you mountains, the forests, and all trees within it. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob and shall glory in Israel.
So a happy ending.
Well, a happy ending as long as we avoid creating and worshiping idols.
I can work with that. And even though the special trope are sparse, the rare trope are rare in this Haftorah, they're still pretty significant in helping to point us to some important phrases and words. You know, I focus on the rare trope first. This week, there's no pazer. Well, it's a thing. This week, there's no pazers. That's the rarest trope. But the second rarest, the zarka segol. The zarka looks like a little S on top of the words, or a snake. And the segol is the 3 diamonds. So there's only 2 of those. Verse 13 is the first pair, and verse 19 is the second pair. And I think it's the highlight, according to the theory. So I would say that it reinforces about the idol making. It reinforces the thinking that you had, that it's a key element of the Haftorah.
Nice to know that the trope agree with me.
Well, I'd put it the other way around. Anyways, I'll explain more about that when we get to those verses in the chanting.
Great. Rick, let's get to the chanting, since there are 31 verses for you to chant. Here's my proposed split for the Haftorah. We start with the remainder of chapter 43, verses 21 through 28. These are the verses that deal with the sacrifices and people's transgressions. Then we will read the first 8 verses of chapter 44. This is what I call the mini brit between God and the people. Then we'll read verses 9 through 20 of chapter 44, and this is the long polemic against the making and worshiping of idols. And finally, we'll conclude with the last 3 verses, verses 21 through 23, the uplifting climax. The Haftarah begins on page 607 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash. Rick, anything special to note first about the first verses before you recite the bracha?
Okay. Yeah. So again, there's not much fancy, not a lot of fireworks going on until you get to verse 26. Hazkireni, the first word all by itself, has a zakef gadol, which is pretty rare. It looks like a line with 2 dots on top. And help me remember is the translation there. It's a personal plea. It's a sentence all by itself. And the zakef gadol is it stands out. It separates itself. So that's the one highlight of that first section.
All right, Rick, the bracha, and then take it away.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amzu yatzarti li tehilati yisaperu v'lo oti karata Yaakov ki yagata bi Yisrael. Lo heveta li se olotecha uzvachecha lo chibatani lo he'evaticha b'mincha velo hogaticha bilvona lo kanita li v'kesef kaneh v'chelev zvachecha Lo hirvitani, ach, hevatani, bechatotecha, hogatani, ba'avonotecha, anochi hu, mochef shaecha, lema'ani, vechatotecha, lo ezkor, Hazkireni nishafeta yachad saper ata lema'an titzdak avicha harishon chata umlitzecha pashuvi va'achalel sarei kodesh vedna lacherem Yaakov veYisrael legidufim.
You know, Rick, if we wanted to cut things short, we could have ended the Haftarah right here. Would have had all the elements of the linkage, a little bit of a positive ending, but we go on and we continue reading from chapter 44. What did you have to say about the first 8 verses of chapter 44?
Okay, so again, there's not much fireworks to talk about. In the middle of verse 2, you have a kaf sofit, which is really rare. It's got a dot in it. Ya Izrek ka coming up. But anyway, in verse 3, I'd like to just mention the Kamatz Katan. I haven't really done that much, but there is a thing about a kamatz, the vowel kamatz. It changes from an a to an o when it's in a closed, unaccented syllable. That's the rule. I learned it at the UJ. It's a closed, unaccented syllable. So in verse 3, you have key, it looks like etzak maim, but you pronounce it etzok. Why? Because the kuf closes the syllable and the accent of the phrase is on the mem of maim. That's what the hyphen does. So etzok, there's no emphasis there. So the ah changes to o. And the proof of it is farther in the sentence. You see the word etzok, ruchi. So that's a verification that the ah can change to an o there. So I wanted to point that out. And then the trope. So verse 6, you have a darga on Adonai. Melech Yisrael has the tevir. So that's the highlight of this section. Koamar, here's the announcement. God says, and it's a common thing in Haftorah land for the trope around a pronouncement of God saying something to get something fancy for people to wake up from their personal conversations and pay attention to this part of the Haftorah.
Well, the truth is, if you accept my interpretation, this is like a mini brit. Here may be, I don't know if it's the first time in Isaiah where we actually have God in God's name, the tetragrammaton, being said that God is the Melech Israel, the King of Israel.
Yeah. And Adonai Tzvaot, the Lord of hosts, he's the first, and Rishon, he's the last, and Acharon, all that.
Pretty powerful verse. All
yes.
right, Rick, why don't you read verses 1 through 8 for us?
Okay. Ve'ata Shema Yaakov Avdi veYisrael Bacharti Vo Ko Amar Adonai Osecha V'yotzercha mi beten Ya'izreka al tira avdi Yaakov v'shurun bacharti vo ki etzok maim al tzamei v'nozlim al yabasha etzok ruchi al zarecha uvirchati al tze'etzaecha v'tzamchu bevein chatzir ka'aravim al yivle mayim ze yomar l'Adonai ani v'ze yikra v'shem Yaakov v'ze yichtov yado l'Adonai uv'shem Yisrael yechaneh Ko amar Adonai Melech Yisrael V'goalo Adonai Tzvaot Ani Rishon V'ani Acharon Umibaladai Ein Elohim Umichamoni Yikra v'yagideha v'ya'erecheha li misumi am olam ve'otiyot v'asher tavona yagidu lamo al tifchadu ve'al tirhu halo me'az Hishmaticha vehigati ve'atem edai hayesh Eloah mi baladai ve'ein sur bayadati.
But now we turn to those verses 9 through 20, which I
Yes.
encourage everybody to read and translation, because they're so descriptive and, as I said, so humorous. But Rick, I know you got a lot to say about these verses because they've got the only rare trope that that we read in this Haftarah.
Yes. So again, in 13 and 19, you have the Zarka, looks like an S on top, and the Segol looks like three diamonds and three dots in a triangle. So when I saw the word Kav, it reminded me of another Haftorah where it's Kav, La Kav, Tzav, La Tzav, and I looked for it and I found it at the end of, at the beginning of Exodus, the Haftorah for Shemot. So here, the beginning of Vayikra, we have a Haftorah from Isaiah and it has Kav in it. And the other one that really resonates in my head is the Haftorah for Shemot, which you can find on page 346, what I'm talking about in the Eitz Chaim again, where it's Kav La Kav, and it repeats, and Isaiah really liked the word. And there it's talking again about, not again, but there it's translated as murmur, and here it's translated as line. So we need to figure that part out, but I'm just amused that Isaiah liked the word so much back in chapter 28 that he used it again here in chapter 44. There's commentary on the bottom of page 346 about the Kav and the Tzav. There on the bottom, it's Kav is translated as measure, but it's basically that these craftsmen are measuring these lines for these idols, and it's just nothing.
Right. Well, if you go back to Shemot,
yes,
it's interesting that the interpretation is here we're talking about priests who are dazed by liquor and they're confused, etc. So the kav, which is usually thought of as exact, an exacting line, is interpreted as being nonsense, gibberish. So our Eitz Chaim translates it as murmur upon murmur, but Robert Alter has
Yes.
an amazing translation, because his translation of those lines is, he calls it filth, pilth, filth, pilth, vomit, mommet, vomit, mommet.
Yeah.
That's his
Yeah.
translation for the words kav and sav. So I'm wondering, did Isaiah actually take some of that connotation, negative connotation of kav and sav, and apply it here to the idol maker, that his line is also filth, pilth, or
Yes.
vomit, mommet?
Yes. And then when I asked you before we started recording to look up other places where Kav happened to be in Isaiah, and there's two other places. We'll just talk about one in chapter 34 of Isaiah, verse 11. There, it's the same verb, nata, nun, tet, hey, as the measuring, but there it's Kav tohu ve'avnei vohu, tohu vavohu, going back to creation. But here it's like measuring things and stones of nothingness is the way I would translate them there.
Right. If we follow their lines, if we follow their idols, we'll go back to this nothingness before we had order created by God.
Yes. Okay. So
I like that.
Me too.
So you're ready to read verses 9 through 20?
Yeah, and before I do, again, this is the Kamatz Katan day. So in verse 13, you have Yito'orehu, It's like the word sohoraim, afternoon, that I learned at camp. The kamatz with the two dots, with the shva, the chatav kamatz, that's always an O, like the word oniyah. And if you have another kamatz in front of it, that also changes from an A to an O. So that word is yito-o-rehu is the way I'm going to read it. Verse 15, there's another Kamatz Katan, Vayachom. It's chom because it's a closed, unaccented syllable. The mem closes it, and the accent is on the yud there. And then farther in verse 15, you have another one, Vayisgod Lamo. It's not Vayisgad because the gimel, the O is the kamatz is closed by the daled, and the accent is on the lamed, and that appears again in verse 17. Verse 21, there's Zechor Eila, it's another one. So if your eyes attuned to the kamatz, and whether it's katan or not, you can be accurate, is my message there. So 9 to 20.
Kamatz Katan Plethora.
Yes, at least one time.
All right, verse 9.
Here we go. Yotzrei fesel kulam tohu v'chamudehem bal yo'ilu ve'edehem hema. And there's diamonds there, who knows why, but there's diamonds on top of the word hema. Bal yir'u uval yed'u lema'an yevoshu miyatzar el ufesel nasach levilti ho'il hein kol chaverav yevoshu becharashim hema me'adam yitkabtsu chulam ya'amodu yifchadu yevoshu yachad Charash barzel ma'atzad ufa'al bapecham uvamakavot yitzrechu vayifalehu bizroa kocho gamra'ev ve'en koach lo shata mayim vayaf Charash etzim natakav yita'arehu vasered ya'asehu b'maktsuot uvamachuga yito'orehu vaya'asehu kitavnit ish ketiferet adam Lashevet bayit. Lichrot, there's another Kamatz Katan. Lichrot lo arazim. Vayikach tirza ve'alon. Vayametz lo ba'atse ya'ar. Nata oren ve'geshem yigadel. Ve'haya le'adam leva'er. Vayikach mehem vayachom af yasik ve'afalachem af yif'al el vayishtachu asahu fesel vayisgod lamo chetzio saraf b'moesh al chetzio basar yochel Yitzlet sali ve'yisba af yachom v'yomar he'ach chamoti ra'iti ur ush'erito le'el asa lefis lo yisgod lo v'yishtachu v'yitpalel elav V'yomar hatzileni ki eli ata lo yad'u v'lo yavinu ki tach merot enehem mehaskil libotam v'lo yashiv el libo, v'lo da'at v'lo tevuna, lemor chetyo, sarafti v'moesh, ve'af afiti al gechalav lechem et levasar ve'ochel ve'yitro letoeva e'eseh levul etz esgod roe efer lev hutal hitahu v'lo yatzil et nafsho v'lo yomar halo sheker bimini.
Very nice. Well,
Thanks.
we need to move on.
Yes.
The last three verses.
The climax, the last section, you have Kadma V'Yazla, your favorite. In
My
verse
favorite.
23, it's the only one in the Haftorah. Shout, O you heavens! It's a major deal, and then it ends.
It is, and these Stevie likes these verses, as you hear as well. These three verses are in sharp contrast to what it is we just described about the idol makers. But let's let the text and the music of the cannellation speak for itself. Rick, take it away.
Zechor ele Yaakov veYisrael ki avdi ata yitzarticha eved li ata Yisrael lo tinas shenit shen machiticha av pshaecha v'che'anan chatotecha shuva elai Ki ge'alticha ronu shamayim. Again, it's a Kamatz Katan because it's not ranu, it's closed by the nun, and the emphasis is on the nun. Ronu shamayim ki asadonai hari'u tachtiyot aretz pitzchu harim rina ya'ar V'chol etz bo ki gal Adonai Yaakov uveYisrael yipa'ar.
Beautiful, Rick, just beautiful.
Okay.
Well, it's been a long Haftarah Plethora today, but there was just so much there in this Haftarah. We hope you all will take some time to read through it and give your own ideas. And don't forget, if you have anything you want to, any comments you want to make to us, please send us an email. Our email should appear at the bottom here of the page. We want to thank Norm Gar for his help, and we want to wish you all a happy Pesach cleaning and cooking as we approach the holiday of Pesach. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week. We'll be talking about Shabbat Hagadol and perhaps the Haftarah for Pesach. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.